All right, I think we're ready to get started. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Sarah. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at McFarland. And we are so honored to have Rick Bernstein here today to chat with us about the Unjust Deeds, Racial Covenants of Dane County. If you haven't yet seen the exhibit, it is in the back of the library, so feel free to take a glance today. We will have it up through Friday of this next week. So without further ado, Rick, it's up to you.
All right, thanks, Sarah.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see such a great crowd here today. I think I have to turn this on. Is it on? Can people hear me? How many people here have a racial covenant on their property? Great. Well, you'll want to meet with Bridget at the table here from the Dane County Planning Office. She can help you file a discharge for that covenant. So thank you particularly for coming to this talk. I started this exhibit following what Dane County Planning had done, and it's gone for 12, this will be the 14th library since we started in February of 25. And I think I keep adding and adjusting the talk, so this is going to be the best one so far. I'm with the Dane County Historical Society. I've been working there since 2019. I had retired from the State Historical Society that year, and they had approached me about being their paid employee. So I'm now the executive director. I work 10 hours a week, so there's only so much I can do, but it's been a real joy to work on this particular project. The picture on the left is the Lucier Family Heritage Center. That's where we have our archives, small archival room, 25 by 25. And you can see on the map, it's really on the southern edge of Madison, south of the Beltline, south of the sewage plant. But it's a beautiful, beautiful park. And if you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. And you can always come and visit us. We're available by appointment. We try to have all of our material, not 100%, I'd say about 90% of it is online in a catalog. So you can see what materials we hold and then make an appointment to come in and see it. So racial covenants, I've seen articles like this off and on for several years. This particular woman in Kansas came across her own covenant on her property. She was quite surprised, flabbergasted that it was there. She knew nothing about it, even though she owns the house. And she got some publicity. And every time one of these are found, it's like a stone coming up from a plowed field. Like, where did this come from? It wasn't here yesterday. But closer to home, here in McFarland, there was a student. Her name was Riley. She petitioned the school board to change the name of LVM Primary School because Conrad Elvium was involved with a covenant in Tacoma. That was a plat that was developed in the 20s and had a racial covenant, or a lot of the properties in the community had a racial covenant. How directly he was involved in that, I'm not really sure. It was quite commonplace, almost matter of fact, that covenants were placed on properties. It was kind of the mindset of the time that these things were appropriate. But nonetheless, they changed the school name from LVM to McFarland, so it's now the McFarland Primary School. But what I really like people to think about is the larger picture. And so we're going to go through some national history and local history about racial covenants in Dane County. This project, the Dane County Department of Planning started this Mapping Prejudice project where they were scanning all of the deeds and looking for racial covenants. They scanned 250,000 documents. They found 1,100, maybe a little more, documents that included a covenant, and 4,000 of those properties had covenants. So they've been looking, I think they're still planning to do some additional research, but that's where it stands right now. And it was that more than anything else that kind of stimulated me to do the exhibit. Okay, so that's the map. If you go online to Prejudice in Places, you can find this interactive map, and it maps all the covenants that have been found to date. So you can zero in on an area that you're interested in, click on any covenant that's super outlined in the black, and you can see what that racial covenant looked like for that property. Here in McFarland, there is one block of buildings, 6 of them, that do have racial covenants. This is a closer look at that map. It's Indian Mound Road, I believe, is the road that goes through the center there. Bremer is the road on top. And basically the covenant was very simple. They can be very short. They can have a single sentence. In this case, it says, "These premises shall not be sold to or occupied by any member or descendant of the African race." Very simple, to the point. A little further south of where we are right now in the town of Dunn, there was another 6 properties that also had racial covenants. This one was a little longer, maybe harder to read, so I'll read it to you. "It is hereby understood and agreed by and between both parties that the parties of the second part, their heirs or assigns, shall never convey the above described property to any person or persons of Jewish or Italian description. It is understood and agreed that the parties of the second part, their heirs, representatives, or assigned, shall never use the above described property for other than residential purposes. It is also agreed and understood that the above described property shall never be conveyed to any person or persons not of the white race." So it's kind of zoning for use, but basically based on people's skin color or, in many cases, their nationality. This is a very typical covenant from where I live in Monona. There are a lot more covenants in Monona. There's about 400 homes or so that have covenants. I won't read that one, but this is the kind of covenant, racial covenant you could find in, like I said, 1,100 properties across the county. Looking at some of the stats that the county assembled, you can see that there's a real concentration of when these covenants were most popular, starting in the 20s, running to the 40s. So there were 375 in 1920s, 319 in the 30s, and 285 in the 40s. But just to be sure you understand, the number of covenants doesn't necessarily equate to the number of properties. So in the 30s and 40s, they started to put covenants within plats, which, like in my case in Monona, the plat that I live in covers 106 homes, and there's just a single covenant for the entire plat. So as these plats continued, they started to go from little single homes or single land parcels to much larger land parcels. Going back, here's a little prehistory to the racial covenants that were so popular in America, 20s through the 40s. In the town of Seattle, preceding the city of Seattle, they had an ordinance, Ordinance Number 5, that forbade Indians from living within the boundaries of the township. So in many cases, they would just move just outside the town. In this case, this is an 1898 photograph that shows Native Americans in what was called Belltown, which is now a neighborhood within the city of Seattle. But this shows where they lived with their canoes, not too far, but just outside the city limits. Another thing that was taking place before racial covenants really started to get going was called racial zoning. It only lasted a 7-year period from 1910 to 1917, where it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but it had a pretty good run. Cities of Baltimore, Richmond, Winston-Salem, Atlanta, and Louisville all had racial zoning. And basically what it required is that if the block was all white, you couldn't sell to a black person. If the block was all black, you couldn't sell to a white person. So the idea was just to separate people by block based on their skin color. Covenants have a much longer history than racial covenants. And Frederick Law Olmsted, a lot of people know him for his beautiful park designs like Central Park in New York and Lake Park in Milwaukee. But he also was a designer of a lot of suburbs. He developed Riverside, which was a great suburb just outside of Chicago. That was his first great bucolic neighborhood where they try to combine the beauty of the outdoors with the convenience of a city. And so he started to develop covenants. This is before zoning and any kind of regulation of land. So they were regulating it pretty much by covenant. So they would design setbacks and separation between homes. It was only later, and we'll talk about that, that racial covenants started to be used as part of that. The first major use of racial covenants in a sort of a larger development or a whole neighborhood was Edward Boughton. He was designing properties, or he was developing properties just outside Baltimore, in particular Roland Park. It was a very large subdivision. And he was the first that we know of that started using racial covenants as part of the development process. He had even written to his lawyers as early as 1898 asking us whether or not a covenant like this was legal. His lawyers responded saying, no, we don't think it's a good idea, that it's probably in contradiction to the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. But he went ahead and did it and wasn't challenged with what he did. So these are pictures of the development from 1910, and that's what we know as the first use of these covenants in terms of racial. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. kind of was the successor firm to his father, and he was the one who really pioneered the use of these racial covenants. He had written books and was very influential. He was professor at the Harvard School of Design and president of the American Society of Landscape Architecture. So he had a lot of influence in the field and was a major proliferator of racial covenants. He had written that there were designs for people who did not readily intermingle. So that's a polite way of saying that we need to segregate the races. So racial covenants started to proliferate beyond Roland Park. In Wauwatosa, there was a large plat that had covenants in it. You can see the welcoming sign that used to be on the edges of the city of Wauwatosa, where they call about restrictive zoning. And that became kind of a selling feature. You'll see a lot of newspaper ads that talk about restrictive zoning. What they were referring to is the implementation of racial covenants. And on the right was the first large plat in Dane County, this one in Maple Bluff. And basically in Maple Bluff, this is the only area that has racial covenants. Another historic instigator for the use of racial covenants was the Northern Migration. So there were about 6 million black people who migrated from the South to the North and the West. It happened in 2 phases, with World War I being the earlier and World War II being secondary. With World War I, most of the migration to the North went to the major industrial centers in the North and Northeast. And with World War II, there was a lot of migration to the West Coast where a lot of new industrial communities were developed. But basically there was a push and a pull for people who were black to move. One was the idea of getting a better job in one of these industrial centers. But there was also a push in terms of the violence that people experienced on a pretty regular basis. So this is just a way of finding a new home and a new life. Parenthetically, this has nothing to do with Dane County, but just as an example of some of the housing that was built, this example being in Beloit by the Fairbanks Morse Company, a big industrial manufacturer from World War I, but is still in business today. These were a series of 4 cement block homes with 6 apartments each. They're 2-story, each with their own entry. Very, very, very simple. But it was really the start of the black community in Beloit. People really love these buildings. Even today, they think of them as part of their heritage. There have been threats to the building, but people have really rallied to preserve them. And luckily, they're still here today. Another reason that people were starting to use racial covenants more and more were the series of race riots. So in part because of the northern migration, there was a new growing black community, and there was also that tension between white people and black people. And so one of the major Chicago riots was 3 days of violence. It started at a swimming beach where a black teenager had gone in the black side of the swimming area, was swimming with the tide and ended up on the white side of the beach and was stoned to death. And there were black people who were very upset that there was no arrest, there was no police action. So they basically overlooked it. And so that was the seed that ended up with 3 days of violence. In Tulsa, there was an accusation of rape, probably false, but it took a couple days before people got really upset about that, and mostly it was the news in the newspaper, the local Tulsa paper, that got people agitated to the point where there was a series of military actions. Everybody who had a gun started to descend on this one area of Tulsa called Greenwood. It was a black, thriving business area. It was called the Wall Street of the West. And basically it also included private individuals getting in planes and bombing that section of town. There's still a couple people alive from that massacre, and they are still trying to get reparations. So that has not happened yet. But as you can imagine, these are fairly old, and it won't be long before there's nobody left from that actual event. The Supreme Court took up racial covenants in 1926, and they said that racial covenants were indeed legal. So that basically opened the floodgates for the continued use of racial covenants. This was a home in Washington, D.C., and you can see an ad on the right where you can see that use of restricted, the largest restricted white community in Washington, D.C. So that's how those properties were advertised. During the FDR administration, there were a lot of new programs, a lot of them targeting the Depression. And basically, there was a huge series of defaults on home mortgages. So FDR started what is now called the Federal Housing Administration, and they underwrote guaranteed loans and also expanded the time that these loans could be used. Before this, they were 5-year loans, and there was a large balloon payment at the end. But under the Roosevelt administration, they developed a 20-year mortgage, would give people a longer time to pay off their debt. But during the FDR administration, there were a separate organization called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And they existed from 35 to 40. They made about 298 maps. This is one example of Madison in 1937. And you can see each of the sections of the isthmus, the downtown, what was Madison at that time, are color-coded. So the red areas are the areas that are considered most risky. And that was because there were either black people living there or foreign-born people living there. You see in the notes of the surveyor, that was the reason for their calling it a risky area. Green would be the highest rated, so the less risky, most desirable in terms of doing business. And the term redlining kind of came out of this type of map. Professor Richard Ely, a well-known professor on the UW-Madison campus, he was dean of the School of Economics, Political Science, and History. Each of those have their own separate school now. But he was very influential in the 20s. And one of his programs was to create this network or this partnership between private industry and academia and the government. So a lot of the government thinking about these loans for black people came with a certain, they developed myths. They weren't proven, they weren't scientific, but the idea of if a black person moves into your neighborhood, prices will go down. That was just the complete understanding of the federal government. And I should have mentioned it in the previous slide that the FHA required racial covenants for any loan that they were underwriting. So you can see a real uptick in the 30s because of the federal government being a major proponent of these racial covenants. The next Supreme Court case was in 1948. It was called Shelley versus Kramer. The Shelleys had moved up from Mississippi and wanted to buy a house. They bought a house in the Ville, which is a neighborhood in St. Louis. There are 3 of these brown neighborhoods or areas, and these were the only areas that the St. Louis Board of Realtors agreed that they could sell houses to black people. But at the same time, the house that the Shelleys purchased had a racial covenant. And there were people down the street, the Kramers, who challenged his ability to own that property. You see a picture of the Shelley family on the left and the house on the right. It was a very large family, as you can see. Mr. Shelley moved from Mississippi because he witnessed a county sheriff whipping a young girl, black girl, and he helped that girl. And he was afraid for his life after that. He felt there might be retribution for daring to help someone who had been whipped by the sheriff. I point out that Chatley Williams, a small girl in the center of the picture on the left, also a picture of her after growing up on the right. But she had lived in that house from a very young age to up until 2020. And it shows you the importance of owning a home in terms of generational wealth. Ultimately, the Supreme Court kind of split the decision. They didn't say racial covenants were outright illegal, but they were illegal for the government to support. So that no longer could courts or judges support the use of racial covenants. And it would mean any part of the government, including real estate, register of deeds, could no longer record racial covenants. So that's the idea between private action and public action, de facto versus de jure. And so when it comes to the 14th Amendment and separation of separate but equal, protection, equal protection under the law, the 14th Amendment makes that distinction. And so that's why the Supreme Court made the decision they did. I show this photo of the Supreme Court makeup at that time. And it was a unanimous decision, but it was 6-0 because 3 of the justices had racial covenants on their property. So they recused themselves. But even though the Supreme Court decision had said that they were no longer able, the federal government could no longer support or advance the use of racial covenants, the Federal Housing Administration made up its own mind. This is the administrator of the FHA at the time. And after the decision, he said that he would not alter the programs of the agency, and that the policy of the government to require private individuals to give up their right to dispose of their property as they see fit as a condition of receiving the benefits of the National Housing Act. So he himself, as a federal administrator, decided on his own that I don't agree with the Supreme Court, I feel differently, and I'm going to manage my agency accordingly. I don't know exactly when that actually took effect at the Federal Housing Administration, but it's certainly worthy of additional research. This is my house in Monona. I did a little research, came up with the husband and wife who lived there. They had 4 daughters, which I understand made it difficult to use the party line. A backyard neighbor told me that it was always those Dahlman girls who were always on the phone. But this is one of the homes in Monona that had a racial covenant. You can see the ads from the area in 1950. Winnequa Terrace was the name of the subdivision. And this ad says, that in 1950, that there was FHA financing available, GI and FHA financing. So that's in 1950. So the FHA is still underwriting mortgages for homes that have a covenant. Turning to Madison, there's an area called Crestwood, a neighborhood that was considered the first cooperative housing project in the United States. John Bordner, who was a land use planner, used to live in Sweden, kind of brought that idea with him when he emigrated. He was a professor at the university, and he established this neighborhood. And basically by co-op, what they mean is each person donates an equal amount, and in that way they buy the land as a group, and it's managed by the group, by the board of directors and the membership of everyone who lives in the co-op. But in 1951, Carson Gully and his wife Beatrice wanted to buy a house in the Crestwood area, and there was a reaction. There was about 37 people who signed a petition that they didn't want the Gullys to live in the co-op. But when they had a full membership meeting, about 100 people, the majority, about 77, agreed to let the Gullys move into the neighborhood. And that's the house he built on Cedar Place. And it's where he broadcast his cooking show from, that was on the local public station. Friends of the Gullys, the Hamiltons, Henry and Velma, also wanted to move to Crestwood. But for whatever reason, they changed their mind. And I'm only guessing here, but it might have been because of all the trouble that they had to go through to actually buy into that property. This is a book called Settling. It's mostly oral histories from black people who grew up in Madison, mostly in the 20th century. But one of the white people that's included in this book is Fran Ramika. She's passed away. But she was a real estate agent in the 40s. And she sold a house to a black couple. And because of that, she was brought up in front of the Board of Realtors, and her license to sell was suspended. The National Board of Realtors had set up what they call a code of ethics in 1924. And they had said that anyone who sells a property to someone who's inharmonious with the neighborhood should not be sold to. So they're just following these national standards from the National Association of Real Estate Boards, and this is how it played out on the local level. Fran never went back, even though her suspension was 3 months. She decided that she just didn't want to do that kind of work any longer. 1968, there was federal legislation called the Fair Housing Act. It was the last of the 3 major Civil Rights Act. It was co-wrote by Senator Edward Brooke from Massachusetts, Republican, and by Walter Mondale, Democrat from Minnesota. It took a long year. It had been introduced in 1966. It was being held up in committee. There was a lot of opposition, particularly from the South. But it was ultimately passed about a week after Martin Luther King was shot. And Walter Mondale, after the assassination of MLK, went to the well of the Senate and said, we have to get this bill out of committee and we have to pass it. And I guess that was enough. And so here's the signing of the bill with LBJ as president. And you can see Thurgood Marshall, who was by then a Supreme Court justice, the first black Supreme Court justice on the Supreme Court. But it took a while. Actually, it's probably been that law that never really fully reached its potential. But there was a period, there was a lot of hope. President Nixon appointed George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, who was the governor of Michigan, had run for president beside Richard Nixon and lost. But he was a major supporter of fair housing, and he was raring to go. You can see the march on the left in Grosse Pointe, which is a upper class neighborhood just north of Detroit. And he's marching with some of the other NAACP members to try to institute some fair housing. But Nixon apparently didn't like what George Romney was doing. He basically forced him out of the administration, and he actually was very open about why he felt that way. And these are a couple quotes that I'll read to you. I am convinced that while legal segregation is totally wrong, that forced integration of housing or education is just as wrong. So if you pair it up, and that's what often the argument is, yeah, I believe in integration, but not at this cost. Yes, I like the idea, but I don't want to give this up. Nixon went on to say, I realize that this position will lead us to a situation in which blacks will continue to live for the most part in black neighborhoods, and where there will be predominantly black schools and predominantly white schools. So I won't say that they're exactly the same now as they were in '68, but there's a long road to go. There's a lot of dominant white neighborhoods and communities, and there are a lot of schools that are mostly all white or all black. So Richard Nixon was prophetic, and he called the number right on its head. Later, in 2018, Walter Mondale, one of the co-authors of the Fair Housing Act, said he called it the civil rights law we ignored. So he felt it never really lived up to its potential. The law's on the books. It's still capable of making a lot of change, but at this point, there hasn't really been the political will to do so. So just some key dates to remember. I thought there were going to be students in the audience from the local school, so I just wanted to have a little cheat sheet. But 1917, the Supreme Court, Buchanan versus Worley. 1917, Northern Migration. Race riots. Corrigan versus Buckley. And everything else I just said. Key points to remember. Even though racial covenants were made illegal in '68, they still have had an impact on modern day America. After the Civil War, black people owned about 0.5% of the total wealth in the United States. Today, that number is closer to 1%. So there hasn't been a lot of growth, and there's still a very wide divide in terms of racial wealth. And covenants were just one part of a much larger series of programs and deliberate actions to keep neighborhoods white and keep neighborhoods black. But the covenants were a major part, and they had their impact. So a couple books I recommend as follow-ups to that. There's one called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. He takes a look at that de jure versus de facto and really explores the different ways that government is actually part of a racial segregation program. It's not just racial covenants. There are dozens of other areas where the government gets involved or doesn't get involved that has caused that ongoing issue of racial segregation. And Leah Rothstein, Richard's daughter, wrote a book called Just Action. Both of these are very readable. They're not academic at all. But Leah just offers up a menu of options for people and communities, churches, individuals, to try to break down some of those barriers. In this case, there was one program they highlighted called Map Twins. It's taking place in Chicago, where you take a map, fold it, and put a white neighborhood on top of a black neighborhood. And where that house sits on top of the other house, you just introduce those two private homeowners. And they just have a conversation, they get to know each other. One gives a tour of their neighborhood, then the other gives the other a tour of their neighborhood. So it's just building bridges and trying to break down and not talk in terms of larger groups, just as private individuals. There was also a Baptist church, a white one and a black one, that got together and got to know each other. Some communities have taken the next step and instituted or passed a resolution condemning racial covenants. The first one I know of in Dane County was City of Middleton. That actually was in 2020. Sorry, the date's off. And then Dane County passed theirs more recently in February at the start of this exhibit. And I had given Patrick Miles, the county board, and the idea of doing this, and he took and ran with it. Monona has also passed a resolution against racial covenants. And I understand it's something the Village of Oregon is looking into as well.
And McFarland.
And McFarland.
Yep, it should be going to the board next week.
Okay, thanks. What else is being done? Well, the Dane County planner that's here today, Bridget, and others, have made themselves available for people who want to register or file a discharge petition to nullify the racial covenant on their property. And I believe they have about 100 or so. This was the first of many of those release events. This one had speeches by the Dane County executive and some of the mayors in Madison and Monona. And it had a lot, it kind of was the beginning of a campaign to try to institute discharges. The city of Monona, not alone, but this is one I know of, they've instituted a first-generation homebuyer loan program. So the idea that if you're, the generation just before you hasn't owned a house, you're more eligible for a home loan than others. The city of Monona also has a $20,000 homebuyer loan program that helps you in terms of your down payment. And that's $20,000. But if you're a first generation home buyer, you or your succeeding generation haven't owned a home, you're eligible for $40,000. So just hopefully making it easier for people to buy their first home. There's also a private program here in Dane County called Own It, and they are trying to build black wealth, so they're targeting a certain community. They just recently announced another 5 new grants. They make $19,000 available to help to buy down your debt or help with the home, first down payment. And so these were my supporters, financial supporters, EVU Foundation, Dane Arts, and the Dane County Library Service that manages the Beyond the Page program. So they help underwrite the exhibit and the program overall, so I'm very thankful for their support. So thank you for sitting so quietly and listening to me. I appreciate your time, and I'll be available for questions. And thank you very much. Anybody have a question? Yes, sir.
What did the Maple Bluff covenant language say?
I don't have that right at my fingertips, but we could find it, afterwards. I can look online here. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe this is obvious, but why does Monona have so many? Or like compared to, say, Madison? I'm sure it's something specific about just the history.
That's a really good question, and I haven't gotten into specific motivations or the mechanics. I think if I was to do more research, I'd try to find out who were the major players, because it could have been the attorneys who work on some of these legal documents. It could have been real estate agents. So there are a lot of different players who could have been involved. I know there were templates that were put together by the National Association of Real Estate Board, and I don't know if there's a connection with us being as close to Chicago where they headquartered. But yeah, I think with some newspaper research, if I could find who are the major key players, I might be able to get into some of the specific motivations why one community does more than the next. Monona was the third of all the communities in terms of racial covenants. Shorewood Hills was second, and Madison was first.
But like area-wise, it seems like Monona's like really concentrated with them.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, if you were to look at it in terms of per capita or land area, maybe Monona would be much higher than Madison.
In big large part, it's when things were developing.
I was wondering about that.
So it was growing a lot in that time.
I see.
Yeah, Monona definitely grew up in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So there were some covenants from the 20s, mostly along the lakeshore, and you can see there's a real concentration, especially in Spring Harbor. There are a lot of older covenants from the 20s, basically for those homes that are right on the lake. So that's a very consistent occurrence, lakeside access and covenants. Yes, sir.
The state act in 2024, did that effectively rule all covenants null and void, or is there still further legal action needed?
You mean the state act?
Yeah, I can't remember the number of it, but on your screen,
Yeah.
The state in 2024 passed an act.
Yes, Governor Evers signed that. And I believe that was 2023, but I'm not exactly sure. Basically, I know that law allowed people to start filing these discharge petitions. And I think they also passed some kind of law making these illegal on a statewide basis. Do you have more information on that, Bridget? No? I think you may be right, but I'm not exactly sure. Yes, ma'am?
If you were to buy a property, would it be very obvious that there was a covenant there?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, I think a lot of people, when I bought my home, 2012, I didn't know there was a covenant there, so it didn't come up in all the papers that I signed. Not that I read everything inside and out, but Jane, do you have something to add?
On that, I was the register of deeds for Dane County for 18 years.
Wow.
And sometimes the deed restriction was only on the subdivision plat. So it wasn't necessarily on the deed, but it still existed.
That was probably with my home. It was part of the plat in 1950. Bridget?
I would add to that there was a sentiment maybe during the 90s and the 80s that the realtors didn't want to necessarily highlight these things. Maybe some shame had set in from their past. And so, which they're still doing stuff for now. And so maybe they weren't highlighted as they had previously been.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of embarrassment or shame or what have you attached with it, but it's probably best if it's brought out into the light so that people can examine it for themselves. Ron, go for it.
Thanks for the presentation. But I had a question about the slide you had of McFarland and the covenants of those 6 lots on Indian Mound Drive.
Yes.
And that development didn't happen until about 1980 or so. I'm not sure of the exact date, but
Really?
maybe it goes to prior owner who had a farm or a nursery there.
Oh,
And when that development was created, then the covenant just passed on to those 6 properties?
it's possible, yeah. It could have been from a previous landowner before the houses were actually built. But the covenant would go with the land. So even if something new was built, the covenant would still be there. It's interesting because the last covenant was in 1956, I believe. And it's underneath CUNA, the major, I think it's changed its name, but the credit union organization. So I know it wasn't something CUNA was involved with. It just predates their existence. There was one also in the football field in Sun Prairie High School. So yeah, it travels with the land. But I'll have to look at that closer. I didn't notice the dates. Okay, one more question.
To your knowledge, do you know if the National Board of Realtors has ethical statements against any type of restrictions or so on? Do you happen to know?
I don't. I know Bridget can tell you more about this, but the Wisconsin Board of Realtors are the ones who are funding the file fee for anybody who wants to file a discharge, at least for the time being. So far what we've done, or what the Dane County Planning Department has done, has been underwritten by the state board. But I don't know where the NARAB stands at this point in terms of the issue. Something that I need to look into. Good question. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I'll be around for a little while. If you want to look at the books or buy a book, please stop by.